It began on a crisp fall evening in a quiet Seattle suburb, where the leaves dressed the streets in fiery shades of red and gold. The air held that distinct promise of change, the kind you could almost taste on your tongue, a blend of possibility and wistful memory that had the power to make you look back on your life and wonder if you'd done all you could with the years you'd been given. There, in a modest bungalow with a porch swing that creaked in the breeze, lived Harriet Summers. She was 56, with soft lines around her eyes that deepened when she smiled and a gentle, almost hesitant laugh that sometimes got lost in the hum of everyday life. Harriet had spent decades devoted to her teaching career. Nurturing young minds was her calling, but it wasn't exactly the kind of profession that filled her bank account or made it easy for her to retire with financial freedom. That evening, though, with the world simmering in autumn colors, Harriet's life was about to turn a corner in ways she never could have scripted. She had always believed in living responsibly. Like so many Americans who grew up listening to their grandparents' cautionary tales of the Great Depression, Harriet's father had once told her, "Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Save for a rainy day, because life has a habit of sneaking up on you when you least expect it." She tried to follow that advice to the letter, stashing away a bit from every paycheck into her retirement fund. Yet as she inched closer to her senior years, she found herself feeling the tension between wanting to enjoy what remained of her youth, travel the world, buy something nice for once, or even just upgrade her old sedan, and the constraints of her modest savings. She was no stranger to the swirl of pamphlets about IRAs, long-term health insurance, and the incessant push to consider sound investments. But Harriet was a teacher at heart, not a financial guru, and money matters always gave her a faint flutter of anxiety. In the swirling golds and reds of the early dusk, she was sitting on that old porch swing, rocking gently back and forth, recalling how she'd ended up with this quiet, seemingly simple life. She had been married once, long ago in her 20s, too young to understand that wanting to be loved and being ready for marriage were two very different things. It was a romance that burned bright and fizzled quickly, leaving her with a fear of repeating the same mistakes. She dated here and there over the years, but nothing serious enough to ever introduce someone to her closest friends or sign her holiday cards jointly. Harriet had grown accustomed to the comfortable solitude of her home, the order of her daily routine, and the knowledge that even though she felt alone, she was never lonely in the deeper sense. There was always a child at school who needed extra help, a coworker who needed a sympathetic ear, or an aging neighbor who relied on her for a ride to the pharmacy. That evening she held a letter in her lap, the edges lightly crumpled from the pressure of her fingers. It was from an attorney's office in Los Angeles. The letter began with formalities, but the gist was this. An estranged uncle she could barely remember had passed away, leaving her a piece of property out in eastern Washington, an old horse ranch. It was unexpected, to say the least. She could count on one hand the number of times she'd visited that side of the family, which made this twist feel all the more surreal. Her uncle had been known for two things: his short fuse and his refusal to update people on his whereabouts. Yet here was Harriet, a middle school teacher with a stable but modest life, suddenly in possession of a ranch that might, if the real estate market held steady, be sold for a not-so-meager sum. It was exactly the kind of plot twist that had her heart racing. She thought about the stress of caring for a large property, the burden of paying taxes on it, and the sheer improbability that she'd ever want to move out to the country. But she also imagined that if things went smoothly, this could be her ticket to a more comfortable future. Maybe she could finally consider paying off her mortgage or even getting a nicer car. She'd had an eye on the new SUV models, even though she normally believed money can't buy happiness. Still, The thought of a reliable, shiny new vehicle was undeniably appealing. Across town, another life was flowing forward with a quiet yearning of its own. Carl Beckman was a man who knew both the triumphs and the sorrows of chasing the American dream. He was 59, trim in build, but with the subtle slump of a man who'd spent years at a desk staring at screens filled with numbers. Carl had worked in finance for over 3 decades, navigating everything from mortgage booms to market collapses. He wore the experience like a second skin, peppering his conversations with well-worn aphorisms. "Time heals all wounds" was his usual line after a major stock dip, and "better late than never" came out every time a client decided to start saving for retirement in their 40s. Yet for all his knowledge, Carl had discovered that mastery in finance didn't necessarily translate to mastery in love. 15 years earlier, he'd gone through a bitter divorce that left him with not only emotional scars, but also a sense of guilt. The success he had achieved in his career seemed hollow without someone to share it with, and the silence of his large house sometimes felt as vast as a canyon. He'd spent a lot of time traveling to distract himself, flying to New York for corporate conferences, zipping off to Florida to see old college friends, even taking a spontaneous trip to Europe to admire the architecture and sample local cuisine. But like Harriet, he was nearing the age where restlessness was giving way to the desire for something more grounded. Carl wanted connection, authenticity, and perhaps a love that wouldn't judge his thinning hair or the lines around his eyes. He wasn't actively searching for romance, but he had an underlying hope that fate might place someone special in his path. Meanwhile, his days were spent advising retirees on their portfolios, stepping in front of seminar crowds in local community centers, and occasionally helping his adult daughter with the down payment on her own condo. He was firmly ensconced in the typical life of a well-off but slightly weary man approaching his 60s, always with an eye on the next financial horizon, yet profoundly conscious of how precious time was becoming. It was at a financial literacy event held in a local college's auditorium that Harriet and Carl first crossed paths. Harriet had finally decided to take control of her potential inheritance, or at least learn what to do with it if she chose to sell. She'd read the phrase, "knowledge is power," too many times to count in the numerous pamphlets the attorney sent her, so she figured it was time to empower herself. She'd never been comfortable in such events, always feeling a bit out of place among the slick business types. But she told herself, "You're not getting any younger. If you're ever going to handle a windfall responsibly, you'd better learn how." So there she was, sitting in the second-to-last row, wearing a powder blue blouse and black slacks, tapping her pen nervously against a blank notepad. Carl was one of the presenters, invited by an old colleague to talk about investing in real estate and diversifying portfolios. As he spoke into the microphone, Harriet couldn't help but notice how he carried himself. There was a calm in his demeanor, a humility that was unusual for a financial guy. He didn't swagger or speak with that smug self-assuredness she had grown to associate with money managers. Instead, he gave practical, almost gentle advice. "You know," he said, scanning the audience, "money can't buy happiness, but it sure can give you options. And options, handled wisely, can lead to something that looks a lot like happiness, if you're careful about it." Harriet found herself smiling at his words, realizing how rarely she'd thought of money as something that could offer freedom rather than constraints. Meanwhile, Carl was wrapping up his talk when he spotted Harriet's kind face in the crowd. Something in her expression, an honesty perhaps, made him momentarily falter in his closing remarks. He felt a flicker of curiosity and then brushed it aside. He'd address the audience, answer a handful of questions, and disappear into the night as he'd done so many times before. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. The event ended with typical chatter, groups forming in corners, and enthusiastic individuals milling around the refreshment table stocked with coffee and pastries. Harriet stood near a tall round table, flipping through her notes, trying to make sense of the jargon she'd scribbled down. She was about to gather her things and slip out when Carl approached her. At first, she thought he might be a volunteer offering her a new pamphlet, but as soon as he spoke, she recognized that warm tone from the stage. "You look like you might have a few questions," Carl said, his voice quiet but reassuring. Harriet noticed the faint lines at the corners of his eyes and the sincerity behind them. "I hope I didn't confuse everyone too much up there." She laughed softly. "No, not confused, just... well, I've never been one to crunch numbers. I'm a teacher, you see, and I recently inherited some property. Trying to figure out what to do next." Carl's curiosity piqued. It was a story he'd heard in many forms over the years: unexpected inheritance, out-of-depth individual, and the need for trustworthy guidance. Yet something about Harriet's gentle manner made him want to hear more. "Could I maybe take a look at your notes?" he asked, not wanting to sound too forward. "If you don't mind. Sometimes I can help folks pass the jargon they pick up from these presentations." Harriet felt that mild sense of relief that comes when someone offers help before you even ask for it. She handed him the notepad, her fingers grazing his for just a moment. "Thank you. It's kind of a big decision, and I'm not sure if selling is the wisest move, or if I should hold on to the land." As Carl skimmed her scribbles, a wide range of emotions fluttered through Harriet. She felt vulnerable, letting a stranger see her confusion. She also felt a strange comfort, like she was sharing a piece of herself she rarely showed anyone. Perhaps it was the metaphorical significance of this property, her future, her one real shot at real financial freedom. She wasn't sure yet, but she had an inkling that this moment would matter more than she could anticipate. They chatted for several minutes, weaving through the basics of property management, potential capital gains taxes, and the benefits of possibly finding a renter if she wasn't ready to sell. She'd never realized that financial discussions could feel so personal. Yet with Carl, it somehow felt natural, like discussing next steps with a friend who cared about her well-being. Before they parted ways, Harriet mustered the courage to ask for his business card. "You've been so helpful," she said a little shyly. "If I think of more questions or if I decide to move forward with anything, maybe I can give you a call." Carl handed over a simple white card with understated gold lettering that read, "Carl Beckman, Financial Consultant." He felt his heart skip a beat, noticing how her eyes sparkled in the overhead fluorescent light. "Absolutely," he replied. "Feel free to reach out any time. If you'd like, we could schedule a more in-depth discussion." As Harriet walked out of the auditorium that night, she felt the evening breeze against her cheeks, carrying the faint promise of winter. She tucked Carl's card into her purse, her mind already whirling with possibilities. She didn't want to overthink it. After all, he was just a financial consultant and she was just a middle school teacher. They didn't exactly fit into each other's worlds at first glance. But she couldn't deny the warmth in her chest, that subtle rush of excitement that tingled through her. Maybe it was the prospect of a stable financial future. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the possibility of something more. In the days that followed, Harriet returned to her routine of early morning coffees, staff meetings, and grading papers. Yet she found herself catching glimpses of that business card whenever she rummaged through her purse. The potential sale of the ranch loomed large, like a door that refused to let her pass without stepping across the threshold. It felt like her last chance to ensure a worry-free retirement, but every time she thought of letting go of that land, she felt an inexplicable pang. She remembered visiting the ranch once as a teenager, riding horses under the warm summer sun, the powerful animals galloping across dusty fields. It was the memory of freedom and open skies, a moment in her youth when she thought the future was limitless. Meanwhile, Carl went about his day-to-day life, client meetings, phone calls with anxious investors, dinners alone in his spacious kitchen, and he couldn't keep Harriet off his mind. He'd met hundreds of people at events, but rarely had he found himself so intrigued by a near stranger. It wasn't just that she was pleasant to talk to. There was a quiet grace about her that made him wonder how someone could live so wholeheartedly in a world that often felt transactional. He caught himself imagining how she'd react if he invited her to dinner under the guise of further discussion about her property. Then he'd sigh and remind himself to be professional. Blurring lines with clients was a recipe for trouble, after all. But the thought wouldn't leave him entirely. One afternoon, Harriet was tidying up her classroom after the students left when her phone chimed. She glanced at the screen. An unknown caller with a local area code. She braced herself, worried it could be a telemarketer or more legal talk about the property, but something nudged her to pick up. "Hello," she answered. There was a brief pause, and then she heard Carl's familiar voice. "Hi, this is Carl, from the seminar. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. You gave me your number on the attendance sheet you filled out that evening. I was just following up about the potential property sale. Is this Harriet?" His tone was polite, but there was a palpable warmth to it that made her smile. It was a sound that cut through the fluorescent hum of the empty classroom and made the day's exhaustion feel lighter. "Yes, Harriet here." "Hello, Carl," she replied, trying to contain the slight tremor of excitement in her voice. They spoke briefly. He'd mentioned that a colleague of his, a real estate specialist, could help get a sense of the property's value. If Harriet was interested, he could set up a call. She thanked him, heart beating a little faster than usual. Before they hung up, he added, almost as an afterthought, "You know, if you'd like to talk it over in a more relaxed setting, I'd be happy to buy you a cup of coffee sometime. No pressure, of course." Harriet hesitated for only a moment before saying, "I think I'd like that, Carl. Let's figure out when." She ended the call and glanced around her classroom, the silent desks and the leftover scraps of paper on the floor. The day had been ordinary until that moment, but it was remarkable how a single phone call could color an entire afternoon with unexpected optimism. They decided on a small coffee shop near the waterfront, a place that Harriet had always liked for its view of the bay. The day they met, the Seattle sky was as clear as it ever got, allowing the sunlight to sparkle off the water. Harriet arrived first, choosing a table outside so she could feel the fresh air on her face. She wore a simple navy dress, one she felt comfortable in, though she'd taken the extra step of applying a new lipstick shade she'd picked up last week. She told herself it was just coffee, just a meeting with a potential advisor, but the flutter in her stomach told a different story. When Carl appeared, wearing a light jacket and an easy smile, he took a moment to appreciate the sight of her there. Poised yet slightly nervous, gazing out at the waves. He joined her at the table and they exchanged a cordial greeting. For the first few minutes, they discussed the property, the potential resale value, and the logistical steps Harriet might take. But somewhere between sips of coffee and the gentle conversation about real estate, the tone shifted into something more personal. They traded stories from their past. She spoke of her teaching years, her early dreams of becoming a travel writer, and her one youthful marriage that ended in heartbreak but taught her resilience. Carl opened up about his daughter from his previous marriage, the pride he felt at helping her purchase her first home, and how he once considered leaving finance to open a small restaurant, which he never did, but liked to imagine from time to time. They spoke too of regrets and second chances. Harriet joked that she wasn't sure which she dreaded more, her upcoming 50th high school reunion or the day she'd have to actually retire. Carl confessed he sometimes wished he'd pursued a different career path. something more fulfilling, maybe involving non-profit work or financial education for those in need. "It's never too late to turn over a new leaf," Harriet reminded him gently, echoing a phrase he'd used during his seminar. Their eyes met across the table, a flicker of understanding passing between them. As the sun reached its midday peak, they realized how quickly the time had passed. The coffee shop was bustling with patrons on their lunch breaks, and Harriet remembered she had errands to run before heading home. They exchanged warm goodbyes, but not before Carl offered to walk her to her car. Harriet couldn't help but notice his polite gesture of opening the door for her, the small courtesies that felt both old-fashioned and refreshing. At her vehicle, a slightly battered sedan with a squeaky door, she turned to him and smiled. "Thank you," she said, though it was unclear whether she meant the coffee, the financial advice, or the sense of companionship she'd felt in his presence. Carl nodded, returning her smile. "Let's do it again sometime. Maybe we can schedule a more thorough look at your finances and see if there's a way to maximize your options." He paused, then added, almost shyly, "And I enjoyed talking about everything else too." Over the next few weeks, they fell into a gentle rhythm of communication. Emails discussing the property's appraised value, texts about setting up meetings with real estate agents, and the occasional phone call that meandered from practicalities to personal banter. What began as a purely professional connection was blossoming into a friendship that both secretly hoped could turn into something deeper. Each time Harriet heard Carl's voice on the other end of the line, she felt a rush of anticipation. For Carl, hearing Harriet's laughter in response to his small jokes was like stepping into a patch of sunshine after too many cloudy days. Harriet wrestled with doubts. She wondered if it was appropriate to let her heart wander in this direction with someone who was partially guiding her financial future. Should she keep their roles strictly separate? But then again, life was short, and opportunity only knocks once, as people like to say. For his part, Carl knew he had to tread carefully. He didn't want Harriet to suspect he was mixing business with pleasure out of any less than honorable motive. He genuinely liked her authenticity, her gentle warmth, her unpretentious way of moving through life. He found himself daydreaming about the two of them exploring the horse ranch she'd inherited, maybe even driving out there together to see what possibilities lay hidden in the dusty paddocks and empty barns. Eventually, that drive out to the ranch became a reality. Harriet needed to sign certain documents and meet with the attorney handling her uncle's estate, and Carl offered to come along for moral support, or so he claimed. In truth, he just wanted to spend more time with her. They set off one Saturday morning in Harriet's old sedan. She insisted on driving despite Carl's teasing offer to use his sleek coupe. "I don't need to be pampered," she told him, laughing. "I'm just fine with my trusty steed." He grinned, admiring her practicality. As they navigated the 2-hour drive east, the scenery changed from cityscapes to rolling hills, the sky stretching wider and the roads curving through farmland dotted with patches of forest. The radio played softly in the background, occasionally overshadowed by the lull of conversation. They asked each other about small life details, a favorite childhood memory, a regret from their 20s, the best trip they'd ever taken, and found themselves learning how neatly their stories wove together. When they finally arrived, the ranch looked both grand and neglected. A large, rusted gate stood at the end of a dirt driveway. Beyond it, a sprawling piece of land opened up, with a broken-down barn off to the left, and a modest but sturdy-looking farmhouse on a gentle slope. The fences were in disrepair, and the once picturesque paddocks had become overgrown with weeds. Yet even in its dilapidated state, Harriet felt a pang of nostalgia. She remembered the smell of hay, the silhouettes of horses galloping under open sky. She could almost see her teenage self laughing with cousins she hardly saw anymore. Carl surveyed the property with a discerning eye, mentally calculating the cost of repairs versus the potential selling price. But as soon as he looked at Harriet's expression, he softened. "You okay?" he asked, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. She nodded, fighting back an unexpected wave of emotion. "I just didn't realize how many memories would come flooding back. It's been so many years. I thought I'd show up and just see an asset, something I should sell or fix up to make a profit. But now, it's so much more than that." Carl squeezed her shoulder affectionately, and Harriet's eyes shimmered with gratitude. "Thank you for coming out here with me. It means a lot, having someone I trust at my side." Together, they walked the perimeter of the ranch, taking note of every broken fence post, every window that needed replacing, and the orchard that hadn't been pruned in ages. Harriet found a certain bittersweet beauty in the place. Despite the cobwebs and the creeping vines, the ranch retained an air of quiet dignity. The sun was setting by the time they finished their informal inspection, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink that reflected off the broken barn windows. They stood there side by side, watching the last golden rays dip below the horizon. The silence between them spoke volumes, each lost in thoughts of the past, present, and future. Harriet turned to Carl, her breath catching in her throat as she caught him looking at her with a warmth she recognized from somewhere deep in her own hopes. Carl hesitated, then softly said, "I know this might be premature, but do you think you might keep it?" Harriet looked down at her shoes, towing a small rock on the dusty ground. She finally admitted that part of her wanted to. She saw the potential for something special here. Maybe not a full-time life on the ranch, but a place to visit on weekends, a sanctuary for her later years, or even a chance to create something that future children could enjoy. At the same time, she was aware of the financial burden it would entail. The constant upkeep, the property taxes, the unpredictability of such an endeavor. "I don't want to be foolish," she murmured, glancing toward the barn. "I'd need a plan. I'd need help." Carl's voice was gentle. "Sometimes it's worth taking a chance on something that feels like it belongs to your soul. Not every decision can be boiled down to a spreadsheet. If this place calls to you, maybe you can find a way to make it work, and you wouldn't have to figure it out alone." Harriet looked back at him, eyes soft. She knew what he was implying. Part of her felt a flutter of fear of stepping into something new, fear of relying on someone else, fear of losing again. But more potent than the fear was a sense of possibility, as though the dusty beams of the barn were whispering that life had more adventures in store for her if she dared to reach out and grab them. They lingered there until the sky turned dark, each feeling the tug of time but not wanting to leave. A chill set in, and Carl offered Harriet his jacket, draping it around her shoulders. She let him, grateful for the gesture and the warmth. As they finally made their way back to the car, she glanced over her shoulder one last time at the old ranch house, silhouetted against the moonlit horizon. Her heart pounded with a blend of apprehension and hope, and she knew that whatever path she chose, this day would remain etched in her memory. The drive back was quiet for the first half hour, each of them processing the day's events. Then Carl cleared his throat softly. "Harriet, there's something I'd like to say." She glanced at him, her hands steady on the steering wheel. "I know we started as advisor and client, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't thinking of you as more than that. I want you to know that I value your trust, and I don't want to cross any boundaries that make you uncomfortable, but—" She interrupted him gently, a small, tender smile curving her lips. "It's okay, Carl. I think I'm feeling the same way. And maybe it's time to see where this road takes us." In the soft glow of the car's dashboard lights, they both felt a wave of relief and anticipation. Outside, the dark fields whizzed by, illuminated only by the headlights slicing through the night. Inside, the air was charged with a promise, a subdued excitement for two souls who had spent so many years building safe, predictable lives, only to find themselves drawn to an unpredictable new beginning. Neither knew exactly how things would unfold, whether Harriet would indeed keep the ranch, whether Carl's involvement would challenge professional norms, or if the complexities of finance and romance could merge without a hitch. But in that moment, neither was willing to let fear outweigh the chance of finding something they'd both been missing for far too long. A genuine connection, forged in the recognition that some opportunities arrive precisely when you've all but given up on them. And so, with the quiet hum of the engine accompanying them, they drove back to the city with hearts more open than they'd been in years. Time, as they both knew, was precious. And for the first time in ages, they were ready, cautiously but optimistically, to savor every second of it.